In 1990, one of Kenya's most successful political insiders was sitting inside Kamitai Maximum Security Prison. Kenneth Matiba had been a senior civil servant, a cabinet minister, a businessman, and one of the country's most influential figures. Now he was a prisoner. He had not been convicted of a crime. He had been detained without trial after openly supporting the return of multiparty democracy. And what happened to him in prison would change the rest of his life. Matiba would suffer a stroke. He would leave prison physically disabled. But just 2 years later, he would return to politics and become the strongest challenger to President Daniel Arap Moi in Kenya's first multiparty presidential election in decades. He came second. Then he tried to challenge the election in court. But his physical condition would become part of the legal battle itself. So who was Kenneth Matiba? How did a man who had once been part of Kenya's political establishment become one of its most determined opponents? And why did his journey from government insider to opposition leader cost him so much? The story begins long before the prison cell. Kenneth Stanley Njindo Matiba was born on June 1, 1932, in Kahuhia, Murang'a. He studied at Alliance High School and later at Makerere University College, where he earned a degree in history, geography, and sociology. His rise through Kenya's public service was remarkably fast. In May 1963, months before independence, Matiba became the first indigenous African permanent secretary for education. He was only 31 years old. After independence, he continued rising through government. But Matiba was not satisfied with being a civil servant. He eventually moved into business and became one of Kenya's most successful entrepreneurs. He became the first black African chief executive of East African breweries. He invested in hotels, agriculture, and education. He also became heavily involved in sport. From 1974 to 1978, he chaired the Kenya Football Federation. During this period, he pushed youth development and became associated with the growth of Kenya Breweries Football Club. Matiba was ambitious. He worked hard. And by the 1970s, he had built something rare in post-independence Kenya: wealth, influence, and political power. But eventually, he would use all three against the government he had once served. In 1979, Matiba entered parliament. He became a cabinet minister under President Daniel Arap Moi and served in several important ministries, including transport and communications, health, and culture and social services. For years, he was not an outsider fighting the government. He was part of it. He knew how the system worked. He knew the people who controlled it. And he knew how political power operated in Kenya. But by the late 1980s, Kenya's political system was becoming increasingly authoritarian. KANU dominated politics. Opposition was severely restricted. And the 1988 elections became particularly controversial. Matiba eventually resigned from government in December 1988. The man who had spent years inside the political establishment was now moving towards confrontation with it. The transformation was significant. Because Matiba was not entering the opposition as an inexperienced activist. He was entering it as a former cabinet minister who understood the machinery of government from the inside. Then came the moment that would change his life. On July 4, 1990, Kenneth Matiba was arrested outside his office in Nairobi. Charles Rubia was also arrested. Their crime, in political terms, was their demand for multiparty democracy. The arrests came as Kenya's opposition movement was preparing for a major rally at Kamukunji grounds. The rally was planned for July 7. The date would become known as Saba. Amnesty International documented Matiba's detention and described him as a prisoner of conscience. He was held at Kamitai Maximum Security Prison without trial. The organization reported that he was held in solitary confinement and had been denied medication prescribed for high blood pressure. Then his health collapsed. Matiba suffered a stroke. He was eventually released in June 1991 and went to London for medical treatment. But he never fully recovered. The physical consequences of that stroke would remain with him for the rest of his life. This is where Matiba's story becomes more than a political biography. He had challenged a powerful government. And he had paid for that challenge with his health. But while Matiba was recovering, Kenya itself was changing. The pressure for political reform was growing. And in December 1991, the one-party system was formally dismantled. Kenya was heading towards its first multi-party election since independence. Matiba returned home. And he was about to attempt something that, only a few years earlier, would have seemed almost impossible. He was going to challenge Daniel Arap Moi for the presidency. The opposition movement came together under the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy, better known as FORD. It brought together some of the biggest names in Kenyan politics. Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Martin Shikuku, Kenneth Matiba, and others who wanted to end KANU's dominance. For a moment, the opposition appeared capable of defeating Moi. But there was one problem. Who would lead it? The disagreement became increasingly bitter. Eventually, FORD split. One faction became FORD Kenya, associated with Oginga Odinga. The other became FORD Aselai, led by Matiba. The opposition movement that had been created to unite Kenyans against one-party rule was now divided between rival leaders. And that division would have enormous consequences. On December 29, 1992, Kenyans went to the polls. It was the first multi-party general election since independence. Daniel Arap Moi won with 1,962,866 votes, about 36.4%. Kenneth Matiba came second. He received 1,404,266 votes, about 26%. Mwai Kibaki came third with about 19.5%. Jaramogi Oginga Odinga received about 17.5%. Matiba had lost. But his result was historically significant. He had come within roughly 10 percentage points of a sitting president who had controlled Kenya's political system for years. And the combined votes of the major opposition candidates showed just how powerful a united opposition might have been. But they had not been united. Moi remained president. Matiba refused to simply accept the result. He challenged Moi's election in court. And this is where the story becomes complicated. It is often said that Matiba proved the 1992 election was rigged. That is not what happened. Matiba alleged that the election had been improperly conducted and challenged the result. But the courts did not ultimately conduct a full determination of all those allegations. Instead, the case became entangled in a legal question about the validity of the petition itself. Because Matiba's health had deteriorated so badly, he was unable to sign the petition personally. His wife, Edith Matiba, signed it under a power of attorney. The High Court initially ruled that the petition was valid. The matter then reached the Court of Appeal. The court record explicitly describes Matiba as being physically incapacitated and unable to perform simple tasks such as signing documents. The legal battle therefore became partly about the consequences of the very illness he had suffered after detention. The important point is this. Matiba challenged the election. But there was no final court judgment establishing that Moi had rigged the election. That distinction matters. Because history should separate political allegations from facts established in court. By the time Matiba returned to national politics, the man who had once been known for his energy and business success was physically changed. His stroke had left him disabled. And his political ambitions never recovered their earlier momentum. There were also claims that his businesses suffered during and after his political confrontation with the Moi government. Some of those claims have been repeated for years, including claims involving his hotels and other properties. But not every claim has been independently established in the same way. What is clear is that his political struggle had enormous personal consequences. His health had been damaged. His political career had been weakened. And much of the influence he had once possessed disappeared. Yet Matiba remained part of Kenya's political story. He continued to appear in public life at different moments. And he remained associated with the struggle that Kenyans increasingly called the Second Liberation. That movement was much bigger than one man. It included politicians, lawyers, religious leaders, activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens. But Matiba became one of its most recognizable faces. He had been a cabinet minister inside the system. Then he became one of the people challenging it. That transformation is what makes his story so remarkable. Kenya's political system continued to change. In 2002, KANU lost power nationally. Mwai Kibaki became president. Matiba never became president himself. But the political system he had challenged was no longer the same. He lived long enough to see Kenya adopt the 2010 constitution. And on April 15, 2018, Kenneth Matiba died while receiving treatment at Karen Hospital in Nairobi. He was 85 years old. He had lived through colonial rule, independence, the rise of KANU, the one-party era, the struggle for multiparty democracy, the 1992 election, and the transformation of Kenya's political system. His story is not the story of a perfect politician. Matiba's politics, like Kenya's politics, were complicated by questions of ethnicity, personality, regional support, and political rivalry. The opposition itself was divided when it had perhaps its best opportunity to defeat Moi. But none of that erases what happened in 1990. A man who had held senior government positions was arrested and detained without trial because he was demanding political pluralism. He suffered a stroke in detention. He returned to politics anyway. He challenged the president. He came second. And he spent the rest of his life carrying the physical consequences of that struggle. Kenneth Matiba did not become Kenya's president. He did not win the election that many believed could have changed the country. But perhaps his story was never really about winning one election. It was about making political competition possible again. Kenya's second liberation was not created by one person. But Matiba was one of the men who helped force the door open. And once that door opened, Kenya could never completely close it again. Kenneth Matiba, 1932 to 2018. A civil servant. A businessman. A minister. A prisoner. A presidential candidate. And one of the men who helped Kenya move from one-party rule toward multi-party democracy. He lost his health. He lost political power. He lost the presidency. But he did not lose the place he earned in Kenya's history.